Fear is often treated as something personal, as if it appears spontaneously triggered by taste temperament or past experience. That assumption is convenient, and it's wrong. In cinema, fear is not an emotion that simply happens to the viewer. It is the result of deliberate construction, of constraint, of removal, of precision, of horror films that truly unsettle do not rely on shock, surprise, or narrative escalation. They rely on engineering. They control what the viewer is allowed to see when information is released, how time is perceived, and where attention is forced to remain. The feeling of disorientation is not accidental. It is built. When a film bends time, it is not losing control of its story. When it withholds clarity, it is not being vague. When cause and effect feel misaligned, that instability is the mechanism. These films are not asking the audience to feel afraid. They are structuring the experience so that fear becomes the only rational response. Camera placement restricts orientation. Editing rhythms disrupt expectation. Sound design removes certainty rather than adding emphasis. Narrative information is delayed, fragmented, or denied entirely. The result is not confusion, but dependence. The viewer is forced to follow the film on its terms, processing uncertainty moment by moment without the relief of resolution. This video is not a recommendation list. It is not an exploration of story, character, or theme. It is an examination of how horror films function as systems designed to destabilize perception through technical decisions. These films work not because of what they show, but because of how they are built. 1. Possession, 1981. Minimal context. Possession operates within an unstable relational framework where conventional progression is absent. Primary fear mechanism. Temporal rupture through sustained instability of performance and staging. How the mechanism works. The film rejects transitional logic entirely. Scenes begin and end without preparatory framing. Performances shift intensity without modulation. Editing does not smooth discontinuity, it reinforces it. Camera movement and blocking refuse repetition, preventing spatial familiarity from anchoring time. Without stable reference points, the viewer cannot measure duration, progression, or regression. Why it is effective. When temporal structure is removed, perception operates in fragments. The viewer is denied accumulation of understanding, experiencing each moment as isolated yet unresolved. Disorientation becomes structural rather than emotional. Limitation or trade-off. The absence of temporal stability sacrifices accessibility. The film resists conventional engagement, limiting interpretive comfort. 2. The Brood, 1979. Minimal context. The Brood externalizes psychological states within a contemporary institutional framework. Primary fear mechanism. Temporal compression through immediate consequence. How the mechanism works. The film removes delay between emotional stimulus and physical outcome. Editing avoids transitional development, presenting results with minimal depiction of process. Cause and effect are compressed into near simultaneity. Camera framing emphasizes manifestation rather than escalation. Scenes arrive at consequence without preparatory buildup, eliminating temporal distance that would normally allow cognitive adjustment. Why it is effective. By collapsing time between impulse and result, the film denies anticipation. The viewer is forced to process outcome before understanding origin, sustaining unease through disrupted sequencing rather than surprise. Limitation or trade-off. This compression limits gradual psychological exploration. The film prioritizes immediacy over nuance. 3. Images, 1972. Minimal context. Images confines its narrative to a limited number of locations while presenting perception as unstable and repeatable. Primary fear mechanism. Perceptual duplication through inconsistent continuity. How the mechanism works. The film repeats visual and auditory elements, faces, voices, spatial arrangements without confirming whether they represent recurrence or variation. Editing permits scenes to resemble earlier moments closely enough to suggest repetition while altering details just enough to prevent confirmation. Continuity is deliberately imprecise. The camera revisits spaces with altered blocking and performance timing, removing the viewer's ability to distinguish memory from present observation. Why it is effective? By allowing perception to duplicate without verification, the film collapses temporal distinction. The viewer cannot determine whether time is advancing or looping, which destabilizes cognitive tracking without introducing overt narrative complexity. Limitation or trade-off. The absence of definitive continuity markers reduces interpretive certainty. Some viewers may perceive ambiguity as lack of structure. 4. Let's Scare Jessica to Death, 1971. Minimal context, Let's Scare Jessica to Death presents a rural setting filtered almost entirely through a restricted subjective perspective. Primary fear mechanism. Perceptual uncertainty through controlled subjective framing. How the mechanism works. The film aligns camera placement and sound design closely with a single point of perception. Information outside that perspective is limited or withheld. Editing avoids objective clarification, allowing scenes to exist without confirmation of their external validity. Lighting and pacing remain consistent, discouraging the viewer from identifying moments of escalation or rupture. Perceptual reliability is never established, but also never explicitly denied. Why it is effective? By refusing objective verification, the film forces the viewer to rely on unstable perception. Disorientation arises from the absence of correction rather than the presence of distortion. Limitation or trade-off. The strategy reduces interpretive certainty. Viewers may struggle to determine narrative boundaries. 5. The Kindred, 1987. Minimal context. The Kindred merges personal history with present action inside a confined set of locations. Primary fear mechanism. Temporal overlap through inherited physical continuity. How the mechanism works. The film integrates past information into present scenes without isolating it as recollection. Production design and blocking reuse objects, spaces, and movements associated with earlier events, allowing history to persist materially rather than narratively. Editing does not distinguish origin from consequence. Visual continuity carries information forward, creating overlap between temporal states without explicit transitions. Why it is effective. By embedding time within physical space, the film removes temporal distance. The viewer processes history as an active presence, increasing cognitive load without increasing narrative complexity. Limitation or trade-off. The approach limits accessibility. Without clear temporal boundaries, causal understanding can become obscured. 6. Messiah of Evil, 1973. Minimal context, Messiah of Evil situates its narrative in a coastal town, presented without stable temporal reference. Primary fear mechanism. Environmental temporal suspension through spatial continuity. How the mechanism works. The film minimizes indicators of time passage while emphasizing continuous spatial presence. Locations are revisited with little variation in lighting, blocking, or activity. Editing prioritizes place over progression, allowing scenes to feel simultaneous rather than sequential. Ambient sound and restrained score avoid signaling transitions. Without clear markers of day-night or duration, the environment itself becomes temporally ambiguous. The town functions as a static container in which events occur without measurable advancement. Why it is effective. When environment overrides chronology, the viewer loses the ability to orient experience within time. Perception shifts from tracking events to enduring atmosphere, sustaining unease through temporal suspension rather than threat. Limitation or trade-off. The technique reduces narrative propulsion. Viewers seeking directional momentum may experience disconnection. 7. The Ninth Configuration, 1980. Minimal context. The ninth configuration is structured around extended dialogue and tonal shifts within a confined institutional setting. Primary fear mechanism. Tonal instability through abrupt philosophical and behavioral transitions. How the mechanism works. The film alternates between humor abstraction and confrontation without transitional framing. Dialogue moves between registers rapidly, while editing refuses to privilege one tone over another. Scenes are allowed to contradict the emotional logic of adjacent scenes. This instability prevents the viewer from establishing interpretive rules. Tone becomes unreliable, and with it the ability to predict meaning or consequence. Why it is effective? When tonal hierarchy collapses, the viewer cannot anchor interpretation. Cognitive effort is redirected from anticipation to continuous reassessment, sustaining tension without narrative escalation. Limitation or trade-off. The lack of tonal consistency may obscure intent. Some viewers may perceive ambiguity as incoherence. 8. The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane, 1976. Minimal context. The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane presents a controlled domestic environment with limited narrative disclosure. Primary fear mechanism. Information suppression through sustained environmental normalcy. How the mechanism works. The film maintains consistent lighting framing and pacing across scenes that would traditionally signal escalation. Visual calm is preserved even as contextual information is withheld. The absence of contrast prevents the viewer from identifying narrative thresholds. Editing avoids emphasis. Dialogue is permitted to pass without confirmation. Events appear self-contained, discouraging the viewer from constructing a timeline beyond what is shown. Why it is effective. By sustaining normalcy, the film suppresses the viewer's instinct to anticipate change. Fear emerges from informational deprivation rather than sensory stimulus, keeping attention focused on gaps rather than events. Limitation or trade-off. The approach minimizes dramatic variation. Some viewers may interpret restraint as inactivity. 9. Don't Look Now, 1973. Minimal context. Don't Look Now organizes its narrative around grief while allowing temporal fragments to appear without formal separation. Primary fear mechanism. Temporal disorientation through nonlinear image insertion. How the mechanism works. The film inserts future-facing images into present sequences without labeling them as foreshadowing. These insertions are brief, visually consistent with the surrounding footage and unsupported by explanatory cues. Editing treats all images as equal in temporal authority, because the film does not distinguish memory anticipation or present observation. The viewer is denied a stable timeline. Recognition arrives after the image has already influenced perception, not before. Why it is effective. By allowing time to function as an associative field rather than a sequence, the film forces the viewer to process meaning retroactively. This delays comprehension and maintains perceptual instability without increasing narrative density. Limitation or trade-off. The technique reduces immediate clarity. Viewers unfamiliar with associative editing may misinterpret temporal intent. 10. The Tenant, 1976. Minimal context. The Tenant situates its narrative within a confined environment where identity and routine repeat with subtle variation. Primary fear mechanism. Spatial repetition that erodes temporal distinction. How the mechanism works. The film reuses locations, camera angles, and blocking with minimal alteration. Scenes echo earlier scenes without confirming whether time has advanced. Editing emphasizes continuity of space over progression of events. By prioritizing spatial consistency, the film minimizes temporal markers. Day's actions and interactions blur together, making duration difficult to measure. Why it is effective. When space remains constant, time becomes abstract. The viewer loses the ability to track progression, which destabilizes perception without requiring narrative complication. Limitation or trade-off. The method reduces narrative momentum. Repetition risks monotony for viewers expecting conventional progression. 11. The Comeback, 1978. Minimal context. The Comeback centers on a protagonist whose present experience is continually altered by unresolved trauma. Primary fear mechanism. Psychological time slippage through memory intrusion. How the mechanism works. The film allows past events to surface within present scenes without formal separation. There are no clear visual or auditory markers to distinguish recollection from immediate experience. Memory functions as an active layer rather than a flashback structure. Editing integrates these intrusions seamlessly, preventing the viewer from identifying when temporal boundaries are crossed. The result is a narrative field where past and present operate simultaneously. Why it is effective. This technique destabilizes temporal orientation by eliminating distance between experience and recollection. The viewer is forced to process multiple temporal states at once, increasing cognitive load without increasing narrative complexity. Limitation or trade-off. The film limits narrative clarity. Without explicit separation, temporal ambiguity may obscure causal relationships. 12. Beyond the Door, 1974. Minimal context. Beyond the Door presents a domestic setting where behavioral shifts occur without a stable narrative baseline. Primary fear mechanism. Temporal disorientation through uncontrolled tonal transitions. How the mechanism works. The film alternates between mundane domestic scenes and moments of disruption without transitional preparation. Editing choices do not establish temporal hierarchy. Calm and disturbance coexist on the same structural level. There are no consistent cues, musical, visual, or rhythmic, to indicate escalation or recovery. This lack of tonal sequencing collapses the viewer's ability to locate events in a coherent timeline. The audience is repeatedly forced to reassess whether a scene represents a beginning, a consequence, or an interruption. Why it is effective. By denying tonal progression, the film removes temporal predictability. The viewer cannot rely on narrative rhythm to anticipate change, which sustains cognitive alertness without relying on overt stimulus. Limitation or trade-off. The approach sacrifices narrative cohesion. The absence of tonal guidance can be perceived as inconsistency rather than intentional design. 13. Symptoms, 1974. Minimal context. Symptoms presents a confined environment where time appears to move without clear distinction between moments or days. Primary fear mechanism. Temporal stagnation through prolonged scene duration. How the mechanism works. The film minimizes temporal markers and stretches scenes beyond narrative necessity. Cuts are infrequent and visual changes within scenes are subtle. This creates the impression that time is passing without progression. By avoiding escalation and withholding narrative punctuation, the film removes the viewer's ability to measure advancement. The absence of rhythm becomes the rhythm. Why it is effective. Temporal stagnation disrupts anticipation. Without a sense of forward movement, the viewer cannot predict when change will occur. This sustained uncertainty generates discomfort rooted in perceptual imbalance rather than threat. Limitation or trade-off. The technique sacrifices narrative urgency. The film demands patience and attentiveness that some audiences may interpret as inactivity rather than design. 14. The Killing Kind, 1973. Minimal context. The Killing Kind is structured around a character whose psychological state evolves in ways that the film refuses to fully contextualize. Primary fear mechanism. Editing rhythm that disrupts psychological continuity. How the mechanism works. The film uses abrupt emotional shifts without transitional scenes that would normally justify them. Character behavior changes before the audience receives the information that would explain those changes. The editing compresses or omits connective tissue, creating gaps in psychological cause and effect, rather than escalating tension through pacing. The film destabilizes expectation by altering rhythm unpredictably. Scenes linger too long or end too early, preventing the viewer from settling into a stable interpretive pattern. Why it is effective. The audience is forced to track emotional logic without narrative confirmation. This places cognitive strain on the viewer, who must continually reassess what they think they understand about character motivation. Fear emerges not from threat, but from unreliable psychological progression, limitation, or trade-off. The approach reduces emotional accessibility. The film risks alienating viewers who rely on clear behavioral logic to maintain engagement. 15. The Psychopath, 1966. Minimal context. The Psychopath is a British psychological horror that presents its narrative without conventional temporal signposting, placing the viewer inside events that appear already in motion. Primary fear mechanism. Narrative withholding combined with temporal misalignment. How the mechanism works. The film consistently delays causal information. Reactions are shown before motivations. Conversations end without clarification. Scenes begin after the point where orientation would normally be established. This creates a timeline that feels incomplete rather than nonlinear. Instead of guiding the viewer from setup to payoff, the film removes access to the setup altogether. The editing does not emphasize transitions or temporal markers. There is no visual or auditory cue that signals when the audience should recalibrate its understanding of events. Why it is effective. By denying temporal grounding, the film forces the viewer into a constant state of cognitive reconstruction. The audience is not following the story forward. It is attempting to rebuild it backward. This process consumes attention and prevents emotional release, creating sustained unease without escalation. Limitation or trade-off. The film sacrifices clarity and momentum. Viewers accustomed to structured narrative progression may interpret the effect as disconnection rather than design. These films demonstrate that fear does not emerge from story alone. It is produced through restriction, omission, and control through decisions about what the viewer is allowed to perceive and when. If disorientation is engineered rather than accidental, then it becomes a measurable outcome of craft. So consider this as you reflect on the list. Which technical decision affected your perception the most? And which horror film do you think deserves closer examination, not for what it depicts, but for how it manipulates time, space, or attention? Your analysis belongs in the discussion.